everybody. Welcome to the Silver Liming. My name is Anne Desjardins. I'm your host here. And again, I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but the reason I brought forth this show is because I really want people to understand more about Lyme and tick-borne illness and really have a better sense of education and awareness that way, but also to spread hope because I can recall all too vividly myself having gone through the experience, just how dark and desolate and isolating it can be. And I really want people to have stories they can hitch their stars to and move forward and propel themselves because this is something that's almost like Groundhog Day, but not in a funny sense at all because it's just all too real when you wake up every day and you don't feel well and you don't have answers and you don't know the best path forward. And there's so much confusion. I don't want to say misinformation, but maybe that's a term as well we could apply to this with people when they're trying to figure out the best path forward for treatment. And it can be very confusing and overwhelming. And so I just really want to, again, bring forth guests that have recovered from things themselves or know a lot more about the inside track and what would be the best path forward. And that would be my guest today. Actually, she is going to be someone who I think will be very valuable in helping people understand a little bit more about the path forward, especially with regard to testing, because that can be one of the most complicated areas to start out in your journey is just getting an adequate and proper test, sensitive enough. We look at standard two-tier testing. We call that the ELISA test and the Western blot test. We know in the Lyme community, that's probably at best maybe 50% accurate. So it's, I guess, a good starting point, but it's definitely not the end all be all. And too many doctors, unfortunately, don't understand that. They think they've done their due diligence by their patient by giving them these tests, and they're definitely not sufficient enough. And secondly, those tests that I've mentioned, the Western blot and the ELISA, are only looking for Lyme and only certain strains of Lyme. And there's just, again, a litany of reasons why it's not adequate and it's not doing people justice. So we also want to think about things like co-infections, Bartonella, Babesia, ehrlichiosis, some other tick-borne illnesses that we could potentially have come into contact with that we need specialized testing for that as well. So my guest today is Nicole Bell. She is the CEO of Galaxy Diagnostics, and she works tirelessly to advocate for Lyme disease awareness and innovation in diagnostics. And I'm really humbled to have her here, just connecting with her in the few minutes before we started to record. I almost started to cry twice. And I can just feel her passion and her compassion for this space and allow her to share more about her story, specifically why she is so passionate about helping people understand tick-borne illness. She had a very strong experience with it. And again, I'll let her talk to you a little bit more about that. But she's written a best-selling and award-winning memoir, What Lurks in the Woods, about her family's experience with the devastating effects of undiagnosed tick-borne infection, and just in the hopes that others will learn from her successes and failures. She's also channeled her MIT degree, so she's definitely someone who's very science-minded in her engineering background into researching the complexities of Lyme disease, uncovering why diagnosis is so elusive and why millions of patients remain chronically ill even after treatment. And again, I remember it's now been almost 8 years since I got diagnosed, and I can remember using Galaxy Diagnostics, which is the lab again that she's CEO of, and along my journey, because my Lyme literate doctor knew that that was a place that was specialized enough and had sensitive enough testing to help me adequately gauge really what was going on in my body. So thank you so much, Nicole, for being here. I have goosebumps even just talking about this, and I'm really excited for you to be able to share more of your knowledge and insight into my community and audience that we have here with the Silver Liming. But if you don't mind, if you could just share a little bit more about yourself and how you became involved in the tick-borne space, that would be great.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here today, Anne. Let's see. So my background, I'm an engineer and scientist by training. So as you mentioned, I have degrees, 2 degrees from MIT, and then also a degree in biomedical engineering from Duke University.
Wow.
And I have always been in kind of high tech startups and bringing new technologies to market. And the last half of my career has all been in medical diagnostics and devices. I've taken a lot of products through the FDA. I've launched new innovations, really just helping to do better, right, in terms of medical technology. And I went most of my life kind of blissfully unaware or ancillary sidewise, alongside aware. I can't really say that word, but with tick-borne diseases. And then just like most people who get interested in the space, right, you get interested because it hits your family. And it was my husband in my particular case. And he presented with really first mood disorders. He was anxious, he was depressed, he was withdrawn. And then eventually I realized that he was also having cognitive issues and he was forgetting basic things. So we had two young children and he would forget the time to pick them up from daycare. He would forget the security code to our house alarm system. And he was a brilliant engineer and executive and high powered individual. So it really, I knew something was wrong. And Lyme disease was actually the first thing that I thought of when I started researching what could be going on. And that's not typical for most of the patients that I've talked to in their journey, right? They go down all these other pathways first. But Lyme was one of the first things that I thought of, just having Googled brain fog and all sorts of things that came up. And it immediately resonated with me because he was an avid outdoorsman. He was always in the woods. He had multiple tick exposures. He'd lived in several areas that are considered endemic. And so I was like, well, this makes sense. And so we went to an integrative physician to do like a really deep workup and lab work. And I had him tested for Lyme disease and he tested negative. So he had the Western blot. You need 5 bands for a positive result. He only had 1 band positive. And at the time, I really didn't realize that the diagnostics, even though I worked in this space, I didn't fully understand the inadequacies of that test. And we did what most people do when the doctor tells them that they're on the wrong path. And we went down another avenue. And she had referred us to a neurologist. And to make a long story short, he was eventually diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. And that was something that completely floored me. So he was older than I was, but he was still young and he had no genetic predisposition, no comorbidities, and he was declining really quickly. And it just, as an engineer, right, I like root causes and I like things to make sense. And nothing made sense, but we went from doctor to doctor to doctor and couldn't get any answers. In fact, they just were happy to track his decline and, come back in another 3 months and we'll let you know how much further he's declined. And it was really quite devastating. And about 15 months after our original doctor's appointment, I was actually convinced by another family member. So my brother had been dealing with health issues with my sister-in-law, and she had eventually figured out that her longstanding health issues were due to Lyme disease and several co-infections. And so he was a doctor and he started researching and he was like, I really think that this is what's going on with Russ. And so he convinced me to get him retested. And at that point, I figured out that not only was he positive for Lyme disease, but he was also positive for Bartonella and Babesia, 2 common co-infections. And so that started us on our Lyme journey. And but we had lost a lot of really valuable time in that journey. And even his first diagnosis of Alzheimer's, when they first did a scan of his brain, they told me that he was in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease, right? So again, I was floored because I was just figuring out something was wrong and really still trying to convince him that something was wrong because he didn't have the capacity to see the change in himself. And they were telling me he was in the late stages of disease. And then fast forward over a year, and that was kind of when we entered into treatment. And so, unfortunately, his story doesn't end well. I think there was a mixed response to treatment. Some symptoms definitely got better, but the cognitive piece really never improved. And I had the difficult decision of placing him in a resident care facility in 2019, and then he passed away in 2022. So, completely life altering experience. And since that's happened, I've basically dedicated my life career to advocacy and to fixing the problem. And having worked in diagnostics before, that really seemed like the appropriate place to slot in and to help really figure out how to make a difference. And then also to really help raise awareness to people about how complex these conditions really are. Because when you talk to people and you say, well, my husband had Alzheimer's disease caused by bacterial and parasitic infections, Lyme disease, Bartonella, and Babesia, they look at you like you're crazy. And I've since dug into all the research, and all the studies are there, and the evidence is there that this is a strong root cause of at least some cases of Alzheimer's and other associated dementias. And so, as I said, it's really become a life mission, and we're really trying to change the game at Galaxy to provide better options to patients.
Yeah, and I'm again very, very sorry for your loss because I can only imagine. Um, I don't think people quite understand the severity of things, especially with this type of sickness, right? Like it's a time sensitive thing. The longer that you go with it in your body without adequate treatment, the harder it is to make it come out, but the further it burrows into the tissue and the brain, the cartilage, the white matter of our body. And that sadly is not a place that antibiotics can readily penetrate. And it just again becomes, I think once it crosses the blood-brain barrier is really game on. Like it's so hard to fix once that happens. It's definitely possible. But again, my heart really goes out to you because I've lost people that I'm close to, and it's just I have my one friend's picture hanging on my wall. I look at him every day. I talk to him every day. And so I understand a little bit what that's like to lose someone that you're close to. And but I also understand what it's like to be a survivor, and I see that in you, and I see what you're doing and what you're choosing to do. And so we talked about a little bit before we started, and just it is more in how we react to things that happen to us. Sometimes we can't control the things that happen to us, but we do have control over the decisions that we make after things happen to us. And I really just applaud where you're going with this and putting your life path towards something that has touched you so profoundly and so deeply. And were you using Galaxy Diagnostics through your husband's um, decline once you got things? Like, how did you come across Galaxy when that happened?
Yeah, so no, I think not really during the course of his disease and treatment. Really, I came across Galaxy, after my husband went into resident care and kind of the decline was inevitable. I really started figuring out how I could slot in. And so I started in the advocacy space. My first step was really to write a book about our journey. And that was twofold. Really, it was first, to raise awareness. But honestly, the primary reason was to just heal, right? Like I needed to process everything. I'm an organized person. I do program project management, right? And I just lived through years of chaos, right? I think Lyme and associated co-infections cause chaos, and it's even worse when you have dementia on top of that because there was so much that was up in the air and crazy. And so I needed to process it. And so I had been journaling as a way to really cope with the madness. And then I kind of made the decision that I wanted to turn those journal entries into a book to share my story. So I did that. I started entering the advocacy world. I partnered with the Center for Lyme Action to really focus on diving into the science. So the Center for Lyme Action, actually Bonnie Crater is one of the co-founders, and she read my book and she asked me if I was interested in working with them to do a project to summarize the state of Lyme disease research, right? They wanted to educate Congress and congressional staffers about all the research because there's so much confusion. And when you're trying to navigate this as a patient or a caregiver, it's nearly impossible. And so they wanted a concise, accessible summary of where we really are and to make the case that this pathogen, and this is just focused on Lyme, this isn't even getting into the co-infections because that would be a whole nother document. Or several documents, but
Yes.
really just looking at Borrelia and how it's linked to complex chronic conditions and the neurological disease, the cardiac conditions, the congenital transmission, all of the things that have scientific evidence and support in the literature, and really summarizing that in a way so that Congress understands that this is an area that needs more research funding, right? We don't have all the answers. All we're asking for is more funding to actually figure things out. And the implications on the healthcare system can be, profound, right? Because it's not just what you would consider traditional Lyme disease, right? It's linked to a lot of really complex chronic conditions. So, as part of that process, I was diving into all the scientific literature. One of the parts of the paper was all about diagnostics. And again, as I said, my career, I had been in diagnostics. And so that was already an area where I was exploring what are the options. And so I just kind of dove in and said, okay, what are the specialty labs doing? What is the standard of care doing? What's the data say on that? What are they doing in the university setting? And I came across the work at Galaxy, and the original technology was developed at NC State and then also at George Mason University. And it really, that work resonated with me for a few reasons. One, they had a strong publication record, really vetting out the science and showing the clinical utility of the application, which I think is critical because, right, you need to have a strong backing in the science to understand what the performance of the assay is in a clinical environment. And then two, it was solving the right problem, right? So the problem with our current diagnostics and the standard of care is it's all antibody-based testing. And antibody-based testing relies upon the host or the human response to the pathogen. And as everybody kind of intuitively knows, we're all different and we all have different exposures and responses, and our immune system is no different, right? Some people can have a very strong reaction and get the very stereotypical bullseye rash and a fever, and other people can get infected and go for years without having any signs or indication that they have a pathogen on board. And so when you're relying upon the host response for a pathogen that's inherently sneaky and evades the immune system, right? It's easy to see how the system can break down. And so what Galaxy was really focused on was direct detection. Like, how do you show that this pathogen is on board right now? Not in the past, right? Antibodies, the other problem with them is that they, once you know you've been exposed, you know you have antibodies, and it's hard to tell, well, are you still not feeling well because you still have an active infection or because you actually have something else going on, right? And so direct detection is what the holy grail is to figure out, is the pathogen still on board and which pathogens? Because as you've noted, right, there's lots of things that you can get from a tick. It's not just Lyme, it's all sorts of other co-infections. And so but that's challenging because, as I said, these pathogens are sneaky, they evade the immune system, and it takes advanced technology to really make sure that you're getting accurate results. And that's what Galaxy was working on. How do we enrich the sample? How do we concentrate the sample? How do we lower the limits of detection so that we get accurate results? And I really liked the approach. And when so I basically just kind of reached out to the founders and said, hey, my name's Nicole. I'm really interested in what you're doing. And I met with them, got embedded kind of in the company and what they were doing. And then when I really became convinced that the science was real and also scalable, right, to really become a wide scale solution for the industry, that was when I decided to kind of become more deeply involved. And actually, in June of last year, I became CEO. And since then, we've kind of crystallized our mission, which is to change the standard of care, right? So we don't want to be a specialty lab that is only accessible to folks that can afford it. We want to change the standard of care. We're going after FDA approval, reimbursements, all the things that it takes to make the technology accessible to the masses. Now, we're not quite there today, but that's our journey. And since like the middle of last year, we've kind of scaled the team and our plans to help us get there.
Thank you for that. And I've got a couple other follow-up questions to that. And you sort of touched on it, I think, with going through FDA approval so that it's reimbursable. But how does this fit with insurance currently? Do you take any kind of insurance? Because again, that's another challenge that so many of us living in this space have faced, is just the monetary side, right? Like it's really expensive just to even get an answer about what's potentially not right in your body, let alone what to do with that information.
Yep. So right now we do have reimbursement codes and we provide super bills that people can submit to their insurance. But generally, we're not a network, so it really just depends on the insurance provider that you have, but we do all that we can to support. Um, but going forward, I think we're looking at kind of getting the codes and then also the payer agreements and relationships that we need in order to make it more accessible. So there is some coverage that people get now, but we're working to expand that in the future.
That's awesome. Thank you from one person who's lived that.
Yeah.
And can you speak a little bit more about why the CDC is saying that there has to be 5 bands for a positive test versus what I've always questioned is if somebody even has 1 band, like your husband, or I think I technically was a clinical positive by the CDC standards, but there's so many people that I talk to that have just 1 band that they're testing positive to, and they're told that they don't have it.
Yeah.
How does anyone have any band in their body if they've never been exposed to it? That's always my question. Like, we're not, I know we can be born with it. So, but in a normal
Yeah.
human body, like it's not there. So how is
Yeah.
that getting put into that classification?
Well, so I think a couple of things that are important to understand is that one, the test that's currently the standard of care was really never meant to be a diagnostic tool. It was really put in place more for epidemiological surveillance. And so, as part of that, they really wanted to understand what's the prevalence and the spread of Lyme disease. And so, specificity was really important. And they when they made the determination and the two-tier test, it was really focused on we want to make sure that every case that's reported is actually Lyme disease. And so getting that specificity was important, but that happened at the expense of sensitivity, meaning you're going to miss some of the patients that are actually positive because it was meant for epidemiological concerns, not diagnostic, use. Now, over time, it's morphed and it's become a diagnostic tool, but that is inherently flawed. And I think even the government realizes and acknowledges that that test needs work, right? But they've also said, hey, it's difficult for us to navigate all of the testing that's out there, and so we're gonna use the FDA and FDA approval as kind of our benchmark as to whether or not we recommend a new test. Um, and antibody testing again is complicated, right? So how can somebody be positive for a band but maybe not have actually been exposed for Lyme disease? One of the things to realize is that some of those antibody bands are not specific to Lyme. That's why you have to have multiples because, for example, one of the bands is really just flagella, which is actually the mobile, mechanism that a lot of bacteria use to move around in our body. And so just because you have that band doesn't necessarily mean that you have Lyme disease. You could have another bacteria that has, flagella and you're getting cross reactivity. So there's a lot of, we always talk about the 50% accurate, and I always like to say the coin flip, right? Whether or not you're going to get tested. But the other side of that is that publications out there have shown that you can also get up to 25% false positives, right? Because antibody cross reactivity is quite common. And so you need to make sure that you're actually reporting what you think you are. And so that's one of the things that is solved by direct detection because you're not going after the immune response and have the complicating factor of antibodies, but you're actually looking for is the pathogen itself present? Do you have either DNA of the pathogen or do you have specific proteins that are specific to the pathogen and are they prevalent in either your bloodstream? We use urine for Lyme disease because that's a better matrix. And so that's a better way to determine diagnostically is the pathogen on board.
I see. Because I kind of, it's not that I don't pay attention to the 25% false positives, but my brain is a little bit more attached to the 50% that are getting false negatives. And
Yeah.
it's like, I just don't get how we can allow that as a diagnostic tool for people when we know that there's such room for error. Like there are other tests out there for other types of sicknesses that have a small window of error, like
Yeah.
7%,
Yep.
10%. Okay, fine. I'm a little more comfortable with that, but the fact that this is at least well known to be 50% wrong. And I don't know how we factor in the 25% false positives that goes into what that makes that equation. But like altogether, it sounds like a horrible tool
Yeah.
to let people's lives hang on in the balance. Like, look what happened to your poor husband. Like,
Yep.
it's not okay. And so we definitely need to do better. Um, I appreciate again what you guys are doing. And I was going to ask, is it a urine test? Is it a blood test? Which is better? Because often
Mhm.
I get asked that too. And
Yep.
it's really just trying to guide people as succinctly as possible. So if somebody were interested to use your lab,
Mhm.
can their regular family physician connect with you for that? Or how would someone be able to get their blood and urine to your lab to get tested?
Yeah, so we provide testing services to any licensed provider. So if they have an MPI number, they can log on to our website and they can order testing. So that can be doctors, it can be like even some health coaches and other folks have kind of MPI numbers, and so they can order the testing. To your question about samples, so one of the things that I like to talk about is that blood-based samples are really not best for Lyme disease, right? So the reality is Lyme doesn't like to be free circulating in the blood. It likes to hide in tissues, including immune privileged sites like your brain, your joints, your eyes. Like it hides in tissues. And so um, the likelihood that you're going to detect Lyme directly with like a traditional PCR. Everybody kind of heard PCR and antigen-based testing in COVID. And so it's similar type technology. But if you were to take a blood sample and test with traditional PCR for Lyme disease, the likelihood you're going to get a positive, even if you're infected, is about as accurate, is about the same as the probability you're going to get struck by lightning in your lifetime. Like
Wow.
it's a probability and a numbers game in math, and the fact that it's in very low concentrations in your blood, and so you're just not going to test. You're not going to get it in the test tube that you draw, right? So if it's not there, it's like our founder, Dr. Bryce Schwartz, says. He's like, look, if I'm out on a boat and take a bucket and I put that bucket in the ocean and I pull out and I look in the bucket and there's no jellyfish in the bucket. Does that mean that there's no jellyfish in the ocean? Right? Like, no, it's just you're not using the right mechanism. And so one of the reasons that we do urine testing for Lyme disease is because it's just a better sample matrix. So first of all, the bacteria actually tend to colonize in the bladder. You know, in early research, actually, that was one of the things that they did to determine in mouse models if the mouse was infected. They would harvest the bladder and then test it because the bacteria like to stay there. And then also, the surface protein that we measure for is actually part of the immune defense mechanisms of Borrelia. So it actually sheds its surface proteins to confuse the immune system. Because if there are antibodies in the body, it's going to bind to the free surface proteins rather than the bacteria itself. And so those surface proteins actually get, filtered through the kidneys, congregate in the bladder and get excreted in the urine. And so we use a technology that was developed at George Mason University where you can capture and concentrate those proteins, which are the protein that we go after works for all Lyme Borrelia species. And you can use that to detect whether or not the pathogen is present. So that's what we do for Lyme disease. For blood-based testing, that's where we really are looking at co-infections. And we recently, in February of 2025, we launched what we call our BBB assay. And this covers Borrelia, Babesia, and Bartonella. So you're going to be like, well, wait a second. You just told me Borrelia is not good for blood. But there's different types of Borrelia. So there's Lyme Borrelia and there's relapsing fever Borrelia. And relapsing fever Borrelia actually does come in high copy numbers in the blood. And so you can detect it. So the assay is actually not specific because it's a genus level, meaning it'll cover all Borrelias, but again, just a numbers game. If we catch it, it's likely relapsing fever just because of the numbers that you get. And then we also test for Bartonella and Babesia at the genus level, so capturing all species of that pathogen. And we use enrichment techniques. We use high sensitivity PCR to really get best in class detection for those co-infections. And what we're finding since we launched the assay is we're identifying clinical cases that are being missed by a lot of the other techniques. And this has been demonstrated in the research over at NC State. They're really uncovering new clinical linkages to different disease states as a research tool. And what we've been able to do is launch it as a commercially available assay, and we're now taking that to patient care.
Wow. And okay, so then I've been taught that there's maybe 300 strains of Lyme worldwide, about 100 in the US. Does that sound right to you?
Oh, I can't keep up with the numbers anymore for all the different pathogens, because some infect humans and some infect other animals, and then they say, well, they don't infect humans, but I think as we're finding out over at NC State that a lot of the strains of these pathogens we didn't think were in humans actually are. They've just been missed by conventional testing. We're finding that out in Babesia, right now, and some of the pathogens, like for example, Babesia otocolii is an emerging strain that was previously thought to only be in deer populations. But we have found it recently in several chronic cases, including my husband's. So I think that, so the number, the types, and then there's, genus is the high level covering all of the organisms within that category. Borrelia would be a genus. Then there's, the species, which could be, Borrelia burgdorferi, Borrelia miyamotoi, and the others. And then there's specific strains, right, which have been isolated in certain parts of the country and so forth. So it gets really complicated. And this is why we do our DNA-based testing at the genus level, right? Because you're going to capture all of them. And at the end of the day, right now, there's no difference in a treatment protocol for Babesia microti and Babesia otocolii. And so there's no reason to speciate and to understand the species until there's some sort of differential treatment protocol. So we do everything at the genus level.
Okay. And you're making me think about another statistic that I had read somewhere along the way that in Germany, for example, they could tell you what region of the Black Forest you contracted your tick-borne illness just because they've got that really mapped out well. So to
Yeah.
me, then it sounds like you guys are able to start to map out, or maybe there is a better system in the United States as well that would really show what region potentially things come out of. Or is it just kind of like a big mixed soup at this point because we travel so much more, we're here, there, and everywhere. People are not so much location bound anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely regional hotspots for certain species, just because of the ecology of the whole problem. But as you say, people travel, people go on vacation. I mean, I I recently shared a story. I mean, I was in DC last year and my suitcase in the parking lot it was a sloped parking lot, so my suitcase started rolling when I wasn't paying attention and then it fell over into some grass. And, so I went, picked it up, and before I put it back into my car, I looked at it, right? And I was actually laughing at myself. I'm like, oh my gosh, you have so much PTSD. You're like in a parking lot and you're checking for ticks. And I was kind of chastising myself. And then at the time, then I saw a little tick running across my suitcase. And I was like, oh my gosh, right? I was about to put this in my car, transport across state lines, bring it into my household. So I just think the lines have become very blurred in terms of where they are, but there definitely are regional issues. But every time I hear a patient story where they say, well, my provider says Lyme doesn't exist in my area, right? I cringe because one, that's just not true. And then two, people travel, people go different places, people get different exposures. And it's not just ticks, right? Like Bartonella is one of the major exposures is cats, right? So cats are natural reservoirs for Bartonella. And if you've had a flea infestation or a lice infestation, Dr. Breischwart has published a spider, a family that was infected from spider bites, right? Like, so there's so many biting vectors. I mean, I don't believe it's as simple as I haven't been bitten by a tick, therefore I don't have Lyme disease. And I think we're learning more every day, but that's one of the reasons why I like to do advocacy work, is because people should have it on their radar screen regardless of where they live.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because I often I just had someone ask me this morning, like, what am I supposed to do? Just live in fear for the rest of my life for my kids? And I was like, no, listen, we can't do that because A, you could get run over, you could have something
Mhm.
dropped on you, you could have a million different things happen to you, but we're not hyper fixated on that because that's not what the experience that we've had. We've had the experience that we were exposed to a tick, and unfortunately, that is what made us sick. But I think personally, like it's a big conglomeration of many things. Epigenetics, environmental toxins, mold, there's so many other underlying factors that play into that. But we
Yeah.
can't just be hyper fixated on ticks. And I'm talking to myself a little bit in this too, because I have a lot of PTSD as well. And I don't want to go in the grass and I'm totally freaked out about it. And just even on the sidewalk the other day, I was walking my dog and he was going towards a longer willowy patch of onion grass. And I was like, oh no, bud, you know better. Like, and my poor dog, but he's so good about things. Like, yank him away from that. And
Mhm.
I look down, and sure enough, there's a tick questing right there, that he
Yeah.
was about to walk into. And I'm just like, ah. And I'm
Yeah.
trying not to be freaked out. I'm trying not to be afraid, but it really could be any biting insect. And so, save short of walking around in a bubble suit, which I've definitely thought about doing that too. We can't be too afraid or too fearful. And oftentimes fear will draw to us what we don't want to have come towards us because we're also just thinking about it, and universe brings things to us sometimes when we're thinking about it, whether it's a positive or negative connotation. But
Yeah.
I appreciate more of trying to like broaden my own PTSD perspective and thinking it could just be anything. Like you've got to let it go, live your life, don't be so
Mhm.
afraid. But I had a tick on me too, coming out of an office building, going into my car through a
Yep.
parking lot. There was no nature involved in that. It was just concrete. And so like we can't really say where it's going to come from, where how it gets to us. Maybe the wind blew it. Maybe
Yeah.
they're so small. But it is important for people to take away the fact that it can be anywhere.
Yeah.
And I wish doctors would really get that idea through their head a little bit better as well. No offense to them, because I know that they're going hopefully with a good heart to serve people and help them, but they need to realize that it's not just a Northeastern problem. I live here in Pennsylvania, so sure enough,
Mm.
I'm in a prime hot zone for it. But it could be, I think I read California had like the fifth highest insurance claims put in against tick-borne illness. And
Yeah.
I used to live out there. I've got a lot of friends out there like, we don't have it out here. And I'm like, ha, ha.
You do.
Sure
Yeah.
enough, you do. And all seven continents, they found it. So it's not anything that you can really run from because that's my other friend was like, I'm going to move back to Africa. And I was like, listen, it's not just here in the US, like it's
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yep.
So we have to be super careful about that. And then, so that helps a lot. And I'm also just thinking about when we're thinking about the different kinds of ticks, can all ticks make you sick? Or because I did a talk at the Borough yesterday and there was a guy there talking about mosquitoes too, and that's
Hmm.
another one that can transmit some things. But
Hmm.
he also drags for ticks and like that's stuff my nightmares are truly made out of. But he said he found 20 longhorn ticks here in Pennsylvania, which they are not native to this region at all. So
Right.
it's starting to obviously take over a little bit more. But what would be my concern with a longhorn tick versus a deer tick versus a groundhog tick versus, I mean, do I have to be afraid of all of them?
I mean, I think there's definitely published evidence of kind of different pathogens being more prevalent in different types of ticks. But to be honest, I think the full prevalence studies of what can and can't be transmitted by certain vectors is still emerging science, right? Like for example, one of the things that's been hotly debated in the research and the literature is whether or not Bartonella is transmitted by ticks, right? It's a vector-borne pathogen. It's known to be transmitted by fleas, lice, other biting insects. But in the U.S., it's not considered a tick-borne disease. Now, in Europe, it is, right? And so it's like, well, are European ticks and European Bartonella that different from what we have in the US? No, no, not necessarily. But the vector competency studies have not been proven in the United States that it transmits. And so I think whatever type of tick you get bit with, I always encourage people to get them tested, see what's in the tick, um, get yourself tested, work out for, look for any unusual symptoms. I mean, I definitely struggle with the PTSD. And I think one of the ways that I try and get around that is, a friend of mine advised me once. He said, worry is kind of frenetic energy that doesn't go anywhere, right? So don't worry, just be aware. Be aware that you could get bit by a tick. Be aware that that tick might be infected, and then figure out what you're going to do about it if that happens, right? And turn it into an actionable step. And so if you get bit by a tick, what are you going to do? You're going to, put it in a baggie, you're going to send it off to which testing organization, and how are you going to get it done? If you start to have symptoms, like what prophylactic treatments are you going to go on, and really come up with a plan so that you know what you will do. And having that plan, I think, at least for me, has been calming, because it's like, okay, this is going to happen, right? Like the reality is that in my lifetime, somebody else in my family is going to get bit by some sort of insect that could potentially carry disease, right? And so the reality is what am I going to do? But what do I do about it if we see symptoms? What testing am I going to get done? And so I wouldn't, for me, I guess my thought is I don't fixate so much about, well, that's this certain type of tick, so I only need to be worried about, X, Y, or Z pathogen. It's more about, what am I going to do if I get bit? I'm going to get the tick checked. I'm going to put myself on prophylactic herbals and other things. And I'm going to watch out for symptoms. And I have my doctors and have the plan so that I feel confident that I'm doing the best that I can to avoid any long-term illness. Because the reality is, if you catch something early, the treatment is pretty effective, right? It's not always effective. Even early diagnosis has treatment failures. But if you keep your immune system healthy and you're vigilant, then that improves your odds. And really, that's all you can do.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So thank you for sharing that, because that really speaks to me
Yeah.
specifically, and hopefully the listeners as well, because it can be a little bit triggering and
Mhm.
more easy to look at, what if I get bit? What if I get bit? But it's like, well, what if you do? You should
Yeah.
have a plan. You should really have and give yourself the confidence of that. And that is something that I talk myself off the ledge many times, is like, I've studied so many more things. I became an Ayurvedic practitioner. I learned more about herbs, how to help the body, how to just lead a healthier lifestyle overall. And I have to remember that I have all these tools now. And
Mhm.
so if it does happen again, like, don't panic, stay calm,
Yep.
just talk yourself through really a backup plan of really what you're going to do. It's like, if you get caught in a fire, what are you going to do? You're not going to stand there and burn. You're going
Yep.
to, you're going to figure out a way to get yourself out of that space and do things a little bit differently. And staying calm definitely helps tremendously. Um,
Yeah.
can you explain a little bit more? You brought up a really good point in that you'd want to get the tick tested.
Mhm.
Why are ticks more easily tested than people?
So it's really kind of it's a size and it's a volume consideration, right? So you've got kind of a concentrated space where you can potentially test for the pathogen. The ticks, like, actually, xenodiagnosis is where you actually take clean ticks and put them on an animal, is actually a way that researchers use to determine if that animal is still infected, because there's
Huh.
a lot of, like, cellular and biochemical communications that happen, right? These pathogens have been designed to be in insects, and that's how they get transmitted. And so there's signals that allow it to basically become and get into the tick. And so you're basically just kind of taking advantage of that and putting it in a concentrated form. In a human, right? If you've got Borrelia, for example, it could be hiding anywhere in your body, right? And so when you take a tube of blood, it's not necessarily going to be in that sample. And so um, there's, there's just different ways of kind of understanding. And then again, the testing will just tell you, okay, what have you potentially been exposed to, and what are the things that you should do about that, right? So um, but it is a complicated space. I think the diagnostics is something that, as much as I've studied it, I'm still by no means an expert. I've got a fantastic head of R&D who literally did her PhD thesis on Borrelia and has been studying that pathogen for decades. And then we've got partnerships with NC State and other universities that literally have dedicated their career to studying these organisms. And so I'm constantly humbled by the more that, the more information that I need to understand and learn and grow. And so it's still emerging. We're learning every day about some of these pathogens and how they behave and how they infect different species in different in different places and so forth. And so the knowledge is continuing to evolve.
Yeah. And that's something I often find is like the more we learn, the
Hmm.
more I feel like I need to learn. Because like you
Yes,
start going down and you're like, oh, I really got this. And it's like, no way, there's so many unknowns here. There's so many things that I still don't know about. I just like know a tiny little spit in the ocean in comparison to the amount of knowledge that can be obtained on a topic. And
correct.
I mean, just talking to you, like I understand you're incredibly brilliant and your mind works very well in understanding this. And it's crazy to hear you say like even like I've got so much to learn about this. I
Oh
don't know
yeah.
everything, but you know a lot more than the normal person does. Um, so can you also talk, I don't know, this is kind of changing gears a little bit, but there's been talks about vaccine for Lyme. And yeah, can you share a little bit more about your view on that? Is that something that you advocate for? Is that something that would be a good idea for people? I often get asked, like, how can they make vaccines for dogs, but they can't have them for people?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated space. I think at a high level, and again, it's not one of those ones where I consider myself an expert by any means. I think at a high level, my view is a few things. One, the current vaccines that are in clinical trials are really just focused on Lyme disease. And that's, again, just one of the many pathogens that you can get from a tick. So there's been other researchers that are kind of looking at vaccines that are more actually the tick bite. So based upon tick saliva and bolstering your immune system based upon that, which I actually prefer as an approach just because, again, there's so many pathogens and getting vaccinated against all of those pathogens can be a challenge. And I actually do vaccinate my dogs, but you have to do it on a regular basis. It's not just a one and done. You have to do it, every year or two in order to make sure that it stays active. And so, um, that being said, I mean, if it's effective, if it works, that's great. I also think it can be complicated because a lot of people have subclinical infections or misdiagnosed infections. And so if you have a subclinical infection, meaning you have the pathogen on board, but you're not necessarily exhibiting massive symptoms. I mean, this was my husband for years. I mean, I think he had these pathogens on board potentially for over a decade, right before he got sick. Because if your immune system is healthy, you can kind of keep these pathogens at bay, or they're doing damage, but you don't necessarily see it at the larger level. And so if you have these pathogens on board and now all of a sudden you get a vaccine, how is that going to react? And how is that going to, you know, what's that going to do to your immune system and to the pathogen? And so I think those studies are important. And one of the things that I have been trying to connect with, vaccines providers to say, hey, before you're vaccinating, you should actually be doing testing, preferably direct testing, because antibody testing is really unreliable. You should be doing direct testing to see if the people have these pathogens on board, because you would want to know if there was a different response versus, in a group that hasn't been exposed versus a group that's potentially had these pathogens on board, either actively or they've had a previous immune response that you could potentially be aggravating. And so I like to follow it. I think it's good that big pharma is paying attention to the space because I think, it's kind of like all news is good news, right? At least it's active. It's interested investors that are looking at doing something for the space and driving more awareness and credibility to the fact that this is a real problem. But I do think it's complicated. And like I said, we see so many co-infections that come around, and I think babesia is way underdiagnosed. And I've had many doctors that are tell me that a lot of chronic Lyme is undiagnosed babesia. And I'm, based upon what we're seeing with our new BBB assay, I'm beginning to believe that there's some truth to that. And of course, we've been doing diagnostic testing for Bartonella for years, and the linkage to really complex diseases like schizophrenia, pans pandus, rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, all of these are really complicated pathogens, and I would love to see at the end of the day us to have vaccines to all of them. But But that needs to be done in a very thoughtful and deliberate way because, again, there's lots of exposures, there's lots of species, there's lots of strains, and you need to make sure that you're providing the maximal coverage.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for that. Um, so I guess my final question for you is if somebody is suspecting that they have tick-borne illness, whether it be Lyme or co-infections, what would be a good step for them to do? Would they want to do the BBB assay that you're talking about? Is there a different test that they should start with? What would you recommend for people?
Yeah, so we have in our test menu, we have bundles where we're kind of do multiple test types. So, the BBB pairs well with our urine-based test, which is called our nanotrap test for Lyme disease. And that's the best combination of direct detection that you can do. We also have kind of best in class Bartonella serology that looks for antibodies, which has been validated and is much more reliable than what you see on the Borrelia side. So it really depends a little bit on clinical presentation. But there is a whole sequence of tests available, and we're happy to, if you've got a provider that will order the test for you, whether they're experienced with Lyme disease or they're new to Lyme disease, we're happy to work with that provider to educate them and to figure out the best answer, right? I think one of the things that we pride ourselves on is we really want to engage with providers to learn and to help patients, because at the end of the day, everything that we're doing, right, is to that end, to get patients better. And so really having that close relationship with providers is kind of an essential part, because we want to learn, we want to understand, we want to share information across different providers to essentially advance the field and advance our understanding of not only the testing, but how to accurately, diagnose and treat as a whole, right? Because it's diagnosis is one portion, but then there's also, if you are infected, how do you integrate testing into your treatment monitoring, and then what do you do after your treatment's over, and those are protocols and things that we're still learning and understanding and refining our recommendations based upon what we get, the feedback that we get from providers.
Yeah, and are you geographically bound? Is there only certain parts of the US that people can reach out to you through? Can people say like, and get a lot of listeners from Canada? Can Canadians reach out to your lab? How does that work?
Yeah, so all states except for New York. If you live in New York and have a provider in New York, we do not yet, although we'll be seeking it, have New York State approval. We do take international shipments, but all of our testing requires overnight shipment, so there's some logistics. But we do have some customers in Canada that we're working with, and working on some kind of specialty kits to make that more commonplace.
Yeah.
And like I said, we've done international shipments over the years. It's just really a matter of, can the person coordinate the overnight shipping logistics?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again for that. And I just really, I mean, I could sit here and talk to you for a couple more hours, but I'm going to try to be respectful of your time. I know you have other things to do besides just entertain my mind and the questions that are coming to me. But I really appreciate this insight. And again, just guiding people a little bit more clearly through some of the noise, right, around how to really navigate tick-borne illness and what to do with themselves and why there are so many misconceptions or misnomers about it. And if anything, I kind of think of this as the ultimate shapeshifter. If anything out there in the world, I do think this is probably the top shapeshifter, and it just can morph and turn into so many different things. And even as we speak, there's probably things that are evolving with the organisms themselves. And we find now ticks that are actually being born with Lyme versus we always thought that they had to have a blood meal first to contract it to become infected. And I wonder if that happens with other insects too, if like mosquitoes are born with it or if it's something that they contract through blood meals. It's just sort of all these rapidly advancing things that happen with it, and it's constantly navigating the landscape effectively. So I appreciate again your knowledge and your insight, and really you taking something that was horrible and turning it into something that is really going to benefit so many other people. And I I I know God chooses us for a reason, and that we've been picked for this mission for a reason, because we're very strong, we can do this, but sometimes it takes a really unfortunate thing or a very horrible thing to put us in the direction that we need to go. And it's part of why our souls evolve the way that they do. But thank you again for being here for people, for having the wherewithal to get yourself into a capacity where you can help make a difference out of something, again, that was so bad, and giving people hope that, things are advancing, that we can at least get an accurate diagnosis to begin to treat properly. And
Right.
I mean, it took me 7 years to get a diagnosis. 7 years. Like I think
Yeah.
about, what you're saying with your husband. Like that's a really long time to go being told that there's nothing wrong with you from a medical standpoint, and a really horrible head game because you feel like a crazy person. Nobody believes you. I stopped talking about it for a long time because how do you explain to people that there's something legitimately wrong with you when doctors tell you that there's nothing wrong with you? So I'm just really grateful to know that there are places like Galaxy out there. And if anything, I really pray every day that this becomes part of an annual screening for people. We go get
Yes.
screened for all kinds of things every year: diabetes, thyroid, this, that, the next. Why are we not getting tested for this on a regular basis, on a regular interval? And how many people are dying or having joints replaced or being put into mental care facilities? I think about the homeless population often too, and just what a susceptible group they are because they're outside all the time.
Mhm.
A lot of them are classified as um, mentally imbalanced, and it's probably some kind of tick-borne illness going on or some kind of vector-borne illness. Like it's
Yeah.
their fault, and then just get locked away forever. And that's just awful, And so again, I'm just thankful for people like you who take this in care and really have a true compassion for it. You've lived it, you understand it, and you will continue to stay, I'm sure, passionate about it for the rest of your life. And I do appreciate your time that you spent with me, and I look forward to following along and seeing, the new advances that come, and maybe we can connect again in like a year and do a then and now kind of a thing, just because I'm sure so much changes by then. And I really wish you guys the best of luck in getting FDA approval, because I know that'll open so many doorways for people again to live to your mission and changing the standard of care. It shouldn't just be for those who can afford it. And this is a designer disease. If people want some designer disease, they want designer genes, you can go get yourself a case of Lyme and co-infections, because you have to pay through the nose to
Yes.
to figure out what's even going on, let alone the treatment. And so it's got to change. We've got to do better, and people like you are helping that happen. So thank you.
No, thank you. And I would love to come back on. And I do think that change is coming on so many levels. I think there's a lot of attention that's being drawn to this. And I've been grateful for all the amazing people that I've met, that are really have been impacted and all have super tragic stories just like mine, but are doing what they can to make a difference and to change it for other patients and for other people in the future. And so I'm hopeful that there's a new space to come where we all get better treatment and better service than what we currently have. So it's coming, and I thank you for all that you do to raise awareness and to help people as well.
Yeah, thank you. It'll always change our lives forever, and let's do better for everyone else then through it.
Right.
Yeah. Take care. Thank you.